Well, good afternoon, everyone. Aloha, as we would say in Hawaii. But I did not bring the Hawaiian weather with me. I'll have to confess that. Thank you so much for coming. I think we have a very interesting panel. I want to say just a couple of words in opening, and then we will turn to our panelists. I'm going to dispense with the wasting 5 minutes on bios, since everyone has a copy of everyone's biography, so we'll just get right into it, and that'll give us a little bit more time for the discussion. This is certainly, I think, a very important and a very timely topic, and with the leadership transition ongoing in China, and with a leadership transition about to occur in Japan, I think we can ask ourselves, and hopefully the panelists will address whether or not this is an opportunity in U.S. parlance to hit the reset button between Japan and China relations, or if, in fact, we're sort of seeing the beginning of a new dynamic which is going to cause a great deal of problems. In my own view, when we look at the dispute right now between China and Japan over what the Japanese call senkakus and the Chinese call daoyu, this is more than just a territorial dispute. In many respects, many people are watching on the China side to see what China is going to look like when it's risen. How China deals with its neighbors, not just in the East China Sea, but the South China Sea, is going to be a reflection. And it's also the first test, if you will, of the new administration. Mr. Xi will not be president until March, but many people assume he's already helping to decide the future. But the same also holds true in Japan, particularly if Mr. Abe wins, as many people are predicting now. I picked up a copy of the latest Time magazine in the airport lounge this morning, and the big headline on the head of Time in Asia is, Japan moves to the right. And this, in fact, is the preconceived notion that people will have of Mr. Abe, and he can either reinforce that notion or he can do something to sort of demonstrate that the LDP, which had previously been known as being sort of a center, slightly to the right party, he can either prove or disprove that it's becoming ultra-right, and the implications that will have, not just for Japan-China relations, but for Japan-Korea relations as well. So I think there's a lot of sort of side stories that are involved as well when we look at how China and Japan are going to handle the current situation. Well, with that very brief overview, let me turn to my four panelists. Let me ask Alexander if you wouldn't mind starting.
Yes. Definitely. Thank you very much.
And about 5 to 7 minutes each. I think there's a trap door underneath that will open up and you will disappear. If you
let me move. Okay, thank you very much, and many thanks to Asan Institute for inviting me to this very interesting conference and to this panel where I'm in the presence of at least 3 and 4 highly respected scholars. I'm in the beginning of my career, so I feel very humbled. I must admit that my research has been mostly on Japan-Russia relations, but anybody interested in Japan's foreign policy obviously must look at Japan-China relations, at least from the Japanese side, as this has been probably the hottest issue in Japan and in Japan's foreign policy debates. So I've been following the issue, looking at the English language publications and the Japanese language publications. It seems to me that the debate has been dominated by maybe 2 or 3 kind of general lines, which I do not find particularly useful to looking at these at the bilateral relations and to making predictions about what can happen. So these 3 kind of directions that I've seen so far, I've been looking, this decline of Japan or decline of the U.S. as well, and the rise of China line. And as Gerald Curtis has pointed in one of his excellent articles, I think it was in New York Times, published a week or so ago, this kind of approach, Japan is declining, China is rising, or US is declining, China is rising, is not particularly useful because it very much depends on what issue we're talking about, what is our interest, particular interest for looking at this decline. I mean, who is declining, how it's declining, who is rising, how it's rising. In Japan, the debate obviously has been very much dominated by this kind of right-wrong approach, generally, but not exclusively, blaming China for expansionism, militarism, jingoism, etc., trying to, and this is, of course, in the context of Senkaku or Diaoyutai dispute. This is not very useful. I mean, both of the countries have their respective arguments. I think the different logics in place, I think a case can be made for, Japan being right, for China being wrong, but it's also made possible to make the argument vice versa. Personally, I think the problem is what has been a bliss so far for Japan, but it's also increasingly becoming a kind of a problem. It's the fact that Japan has been the country that modernized first in the region. So the territorial dispute that Japan has now with China and also with Korea, I think very much they relate to this problem, to the history of Japan being the first modernizer that internalized the rules of the international society at that time and followed them. Again, who is right, who is wrong is not something I want to deal with. And there's also what I've seen is kind of criminology-like approach in Japanese media, quasi-academic publications. I think it's been also quite prominent in the US media, basically trying to look at who stands next to whom, who talks, who is friends with whom, trying to analyze the possible direction that the new Chinese leadership will take. And quite a similar approach we've seen also apply to Japan as well. Obviously, it's not criminology, but it's also trying to predict by, friendships, affiliations, what is going to be the foreign policy of Japan under the new leadership, and it looks like the LDP is going to win the elections, at least according to the latest polls from Nikkei Shimbun, Nikkei newspaper. But there's so many ifs and whys and there that I think it seems to me that these approaches are not particularly useful to analyzing the state of relations today, but also the possible direction that they're going to take with the change of leadership in Japan, but also in China, I guess, as well. So what I'm trying to do is to look at Japan-China relations through the prisms of international relation theories. And within these theories, there are there are also different approaches and different arguments, but it seems to me that the theories of international relations, they probably provide us with the most appropriate, I don't think there's such a thing as objectivism in social sciences, but the closest to objective, scientific, if you want to call it, attempt to analyze the state of bilateral relations today and the possible direction. So what I'm going to do now is very briefly look at three strands of main international relation theories and how the bilateral relations can be seen through them. Realism, which approaches states as rational actors, basically says that ideologies do not matter, ideas don't matter. States, the only thing they want to do is to enhance their capabilities, their utilities, pursue their rational interests. From the prism of realism, I think we can argue that the conflict that we see today between China and Japan is probably only the beginning of a much bigger conflict, as China is rising in militarily and economically terms. It wants to expand its utilities, it wants to expand its power. So what we could see is a clash between China and Japan-US. We can probably, again, looking at from a realism perspective, we could predict Japan going nuclear. Or again, so what we can see is a major clash between China, Japan, US, alliance with Japan, either going nuclear or just aligning itself with the US as it is now. Or another possibility, I think, is a limited confrontation that will lead to Chinese defeat, limited again defeat, and China will treat or accommodate the US and Japan's demands. Another possibility, which has been entertained for a while in Japan, is that Japan actually will align itself with China. And this is something that I think hardcore realists would argue that Japan actually should align with China and balance together with the rising power, balance against the declining power. But I think the possibilities or the prospects of this, for a variety of reasons, which I think many of you know much better and probably will be discussed by other panelists, are very dim. Another possible approach to bilateral relations is through the lens of liberalism, and again, liberalism is a very diverse approach. But one of the arguments forwarded by liberal scholars is that basically they look at the economy, they look at economic independence, they look at absolute gains as opposed to relative gains. So absolute gains, states more interested in gaining more from what they have now than as compared to their rivals or to other states. So I think what we can expect through the lens of liberalism is that economic interdependence between Japan and China, and I guess the US as well, will prevent escalation in the territorial disputes, as the Chinese or the Japanese, or both of them, will eventually realize that it's hurting their economic interests, and they will reach some kind of face-saving compromise through negotiations, bilateral negotiations, multilateral negotiations, or through an arbitration, which I think is also unlikely, of the ICJ, by the International Court of Justice. And the last theory is constructivism. Constructivism looks at, well, again, this is a very simplified version of constructivism, argues that ideas, norms, they are the ones that define national interests. And if we approach China-Japan relations or Japan-China relations through the prism of constructivism, we can actually go in two directions, either a pessimistic one or an optimistic one. The optimistic one would argue that China will gradually internalize the international norms of peaceful settlements of disputes, or it has already internalized them, or in the process of internalizing them. And there will be it will reach some kind of a compromise, or again, arbitration, quite similar to liberalism actually, with Japan. And the pessimistic one would argue that China's identity as a victim of Japan, but also of broader 19th century, 20th century imperialism and expansionism on one side. So this is China's identity, but also we have on the other side we have Japan's nationalist identity, reinterpretation of history of Japan, combined with its sense of superiority vis-à-vis China, vis-à-vis Asia in general, will dominate their perception of national interests and their foreign policies, and possibly lead to an irrational, from realist perspective, irrational military clash. Another version of constructivism, I think, it's looking at China's position in the region as reconstruction of the Sinocentric order which existed here before Western colonialism and imperialism. And it's looking at it basically as reemergence of China again, and not only of China, but of the Sinocentric regional order, with China as the regional leader, as a benevolent hegemon. But I think this kind of, what constructivists would argue that all the countries in the region, they should perceive, it's about subjective perception. So they should look at this, they should share this understanding of China as a regional leader and a benevolent hegemon, and this is obviously something we do not see in Japan today. So this, I think this scenario is definitely not something that we can expect to happen in the nearest future. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Okay. Hello, my name is Jungmin So, and I'm teaching Chinese politics at Yonsei University. And actually, I'm not an international politics scholars. I'm doing largely ideology and nationalism in China. So, but I'll do my best to just bring some implications regarding how domestic politics can influence the long-lasting conflicts in East Asia. Actually, recently I was very interested in this term, being normal. Being normal. That means, actually came from Japanese discourse of normal state. Or in Japan, in China also maybe there is a very deep sense of, current status as abnormal, or unusual, because they believe that they are not getting the proper status or legitimate positions as they used to have. But what does it mean by normal? Let's see. If they have a strong desire to be normal, that means their current situation is not normal. Then you have to compare with current situation with somewhere else, or in timeline in the past. When was Japan a normal state? When was China a normal state? Let's go back. Before 1945, was Japan normal? That's the place where they want to come back? Or before Meiji Restoration? That's the normal modern world they wish to restore? No, we cannot find any place in the past. Case of China, let's see. When was all the situation was normal for them? Before economic reform, or before 1949, or 1911? When was it? So, this strong sense of redemption in East Asia, maybe Korea is not an exception, actually, but the strong sense of redemption produces a certain kinds of structure of conflict, ideological structure of conflict, which cannot be easily solved by diplomatic measures. That is basically the source of conflict we have. And then how to solve all those tensions. Actually, the sources lies far beneath the surface, and then we have to read that, and that might be the something we have to consider, because we are not considering the kinds of identity structure of each country, as Alexander already mentions, that maybe the historical legitimacy of CCP comes from their anti-Japanese struggles. Or even if you read Korean constitutions, the ruling regimes or the creator of the state claimed their legitimacy because they fought against Japan. Japan also has a very strong sense of the first modernizer in East Asia, and then somehow they lost their status. So they all want to go back. They all want to claim something through the mirror image of the enemy. And maybe without Japan or the colonial history, it might be very difficult for Chinese ruler to maintain their legitimacy in deeper sense. Right? For Japan, without Chinese threat or defending China or returning Japan back to the normal situation, then these politicians, like far right-wing politicians, may lose their stand. So this is kinds of hostile coexistence of right-wing politicians in East Asia. So, well, I don't have solutions. I don't have very easy solution but I do know that it's not going to be solved by just a few summits among presidents or just some diplomatic stuff. The solution requires much fundamental and deeper interactions among cultures and nations and civilization in many ways. So, but I can I will further elaborate my points in the process of discussions. I will stop here.
Good. Thank you very much. Togo Sensei.
Since the time given by the moderator is 5 to 7 minutes, I will try to concentrate on the single issue which is dividing Japan and China, which is the Senkaku-Diaota issue. In the whole post-war Japanese foreign policy, I don't think that there was any incident which had such a profound impact on Japan-China relations, and basically as a total defeat on the Japanese side. Why? Because at this point in time, it seems that China has gained everything it wanted, and Japan has lost on all its ground. First, after September the 11th, China is now regularly entering into the territorial waters of Japan, in a way, in a time with a timing as they wish. And it does seem that Japan has no way to stop it. And second, China succeeded in converting to the issue as a symbol of their national unity, bringing back to the 19th century history and making it a symbol of Japan to China's invasion to China, which is very conducive to the present-day bondage and national unity of China. And third, although the position of Taiwan and China differs a little on this issue, China and Taiwan have found a common ground to unite themselves. And fourthly, on economic terms, I think Japanese companies are suffering more than the Chinese economy. In all aspects, Japan has not gained anything. If I can think of one aspect which may be a damage for China is the losing of long-term trust by the Japanese people to China. But this is a very long-term thing. Why this happened? I think all Chinese would agree, I'm sure you would agree, that this is because of this intrigue, ill-plotted actions by the Governor Ishihara and Prime Minister Noda, kind of playing the role of a good cop and bad cop, but basically intriguing to nationalize Senkaku. Whereas other Japanese who has been living through this sort of, I can swear to my mother that this was not the case. And conversely, in Japan, there is an emerging kind of view that Prime Minister Noda fell into the trap structured by China. Personally, individually, I think that truth lies somewhere there. But the essence was that Noda miscalculated. And as a result, this proven to be a total failure of Japan. I think the responsibility of this miscalculation is great on the part of my government. But more important question, what to do? What to do? And in accordance with the classic theory of international relations, from Japan's point of view, there are two options, two measures to take. One is deterrence, which is now becoming inevitable, but another is dialogue. We should have dialogue in order to prevent the situation to worsen. But then, at the initial stage, what to aim? And in my view, there are two things. On the Japan side, we should continue voluntarily these three no's of not entering, not researching, and not building. Actually, policy which is still preserved and implemented by the present-day government. On China's side, the only thing which I think China is really advised is to not entering into the territorial waters of Senkaku. Now, would China agree to do this? I don't know. But I acknowledge in full that China has a right to claim, right to speak, right to bring this issue into bilateral negotiations, right to take it into international forum, United States. Your diaspora has a right to make a big advertisement in New York Times, wherever. But there's one measure which I strongly disrecommend. That is entering into the territorial waters, because this is dangerous. And also, in terms of the three territorial issues in Northeast Asia, Japan has been claiming northern territories to Russia and Takeshima to Korea. But in neither cases And this I can say based on my personal experience in working in the foreign ministry and being a participant and for many years responsible to our negotiations on territorial issues. Japan has never, ever thought of using forces in, for instance, entering into the territorial waters of the Kuriles. And this Japanese peaceful, completely peaceful approach on territorial issues, I think should get some credit in the international community. I also consider that in this dialogue, Japanese side should be ready to listen everything which China wants to raise. And from this perspective, present-day Japanese government policy of arguing that territorial issue does not exist with China, and there's nothing to talk about it. This is the official government policy. I think, well, I'm in total disagreement to this policy. In the negotiations we had with Russia from 1978 to 1986, then Foreign Minister of Russia, Gromyko, told us that territorial issue with Japan does not exist. Therefore, if Japan insists on this issue, then I'm not going to Japan. The Japanese Foreign Ministry said that, okay, we don't care, and we will not send our Foreign Minister. And for 8 years, there was no talks in capitals among the foreign ministers. I've been working in Russia then, and I had some ability. Well, there was some room of talking to Russians in think tanks, but I really told them that it's one thing that Russia considers Kurils theirs, but therefore arguing that territorial issue does not exist is just arrogance, and it's humiliating. It just humiliates Japan. Why should we humiliate China in a situation where we might get into war? And also, it's hypocritical because the fact that from 1972 onwards to this day, Japan is not allowing Japanese to enter into the Senkaku is simply because politically we acknowledge the existence of the issue. So in concluding, if in the new talks, if the talks between the new Japanese administration and the Chinese administration will not come out into some kind of modus vivendi in realizing the two objectives which I outlined, I think Japan and China is going to enter into a very dangerous situation. You have to already notice the clause 132 of the LDP's election platform, which reads that we shall strengthen effective control and consider permanent stationing of civil servants on these islands to protect the islands. If this takes place immediately after the election, I don't see where escalation would lead us. I don't think it will happen immediately because Abe, I think has at least ability to listen to advisors. And I hope that Abe will be surrounded as good as advisors as in the previous occasion. But if China continues this encroachment or this entering into the territorial waters, there will be some national forces in Japan that something is wrong. Something has to be done with it. Where this lead to, I have no clear vision. But the only thing I can say is that this is very dangerous. I have some comments to the constructive views, which
we'll come back
I will leave.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Professor Wang.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Cossa. I will try my hard to not to fall into the backdoor and disappear. But I think Ambassador Togo just gave a very sort-minded analysis of the situation of Diaoyu and the Senkaku disputes. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to inject, I think, maybe a grain of optimism into pessimism. So I will try to go beyond the very specific disputes and try to focus on take a look at the broader pictures of China-Japan relations. I think when Hariyama first came in as a DPJ prime minister and proposed this concept of East Asian community in 2009, that seems to stand as the bright moment in China-Japan relations. And perhaps, I think, in the international relations of Northeast Asia as a whole as well. And maybe we can call it a quote-unquote neverland, since it never happened, and we actually never got there. But nevertheless, I think in just 3 years, China-Japan relations seems to have been back to the future, and increasingly being trapped in a simmering security dilemma, characterized by repeated flashing up of territorial disputes, increasing strategic distrust between two countries, and the spilling of political disputes into economic arena. What is used to be so-called cool in politics, warm in economy, 正冷经热, now has been replaced by cool in both politics and economy, 正冷经冷. So why is there such a downward change? Several explanations might be offered. The shift in relative power positions between China and Japan, and the psychological effects that come with it. Japan's turning to the right, China's assertiveness, as well as rising nationalism in both countries, etc. So what are we going to do about it? Ambassador Togo just offered some advice. I think fundamentally we should understand that a Sino-Japanese amity will be in no party's interest, and in the final analysis, the cultivation and development of a close, robust, and healthy bilateral relations will be in both countries and both people's interest. And specifically, I would also like to make a few observations. Number one, I think we should all understand how deeply China and Japan are economically interdependent nowadays. Completely decoupling the two economies will be so costly that it becomes unthinkable. Therefore, it will be of fundamental importance for two countries to prevent political disputes from spilling over into economic arenas. So to be cool in politics and warm in economy should be the minimal goal that should provide the caution for further deterioration in bilateral relations. And number two, I think we cannot also ignore the perceptual factors that have contributed to the deepening of security dilemma between China and Japan. There are actually misperceptions, in my view, on both sides about each other's strategic intention. Both countries should examine critically their exaggerated fears about each other. Japan should have an objective assessment of China's rise, adjust psychologically to the rise of China, and avoid exaggerating the China's threat. And China should also acknowledge Japan's legitimate security concern when facing China's rise. And it should avoid exaggerated fears of Japanese remilitarization. And number three, I think both countries should also better, quote-unquote, manage public opinion and rein in nationalism. Political leaders in both countries should not fall prey to nationalism. And at the societal level, I think more people-to-people exchanges, particularly exchanges among young people between the two countries, should be strongly encouraged. And lastly, for China, both its elites and the public would have to think very seriously about the question how it should use increased power and for what purpose. Historically, when great power rise, they rarely display strategic self-restraint. And as a matter of fact, I would say strategic self-restraint is a virtue that is in short supply in international politics. But China has benefited greatly from its strategic self-restraint in the past 3 decades, and it should continue to do so in the decades to come. For Japan, its elites and public should also think hard about the fact that unless it can achieve a genuine reconciliation with its neighbors on issues such as history and war crimes, Japan cannot expect to become a country that it will be politically influential and morally respectable. Nationalism and turning to the right should not be the answer to Japan's aspirations and ambitions. I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've had 4 very interesting, somewhat overlapping, and perhaps a little contradictory in some respects presentations. I want to ask sort of a broad general question to all 4 of you, and then in your answer, if you have other questions you want to relate to one another, please ask those as well, and we'll have a little bit of a dialogue among the 5 of us, and then still leave plenty of time for conversations more broadly and questions from the floor. But I think that Togo Sensei said something to the effect, I want to put words in your mouth, but that the main cause of the problem between China and Japan today is over the territorial issue and senkakus. And I wonder whether or not everyone agrees that this is the cause of the problem, or whether this is a symptom of the problem, or whether this has become a symbol of a much deeper problem. Because my own personal view, as you might guess from the tone of the question, is that this is just the latest symptom and has become a symbol on both sides. But there are deeper problems that we need to, at some point, address. And Togo Sensei, let me start with you, and then we'll go to the others.
No, I do not disagree to your description of symptom. Yeah. But this symptom, this single incident has become so important, in my view, right, that unless we find a way of managing this symptom, it will now become very difficult to enter into deeper layers. That was my view. Do you want me to follow my questions? Right?
Yes. If you like
but I wanted to react to this constructive view, because basically by my own bringing, I am a constructivist, I think, an optimist constructivist. So I do not share your view that constructivism does not have much role to play at this point in time. I saw the question of rise of China as following. It started with the economy, then it moved to politics, now it moved to military, but ultimately it is going to be in the sphere of culture, worldview. And I was expecting from China to come up with some kind of new ideas. I don't mind based on former Sino-centric world, but adapted to the 21st century to be acceptable to the countries of the region and globally, because China has now become a global power. So my most important question in the last few years was what will be Japan's response to this? Now, I was thinking that Japan has to come up a new, Japan's view of civilization. And personally, I wrote a book, and I wrote in this that my view is to construct Japan as an open Edo. But when I wrote this notion, I had the image of a Sino-centric world in the 260 years of Edo period. Basically, Japan was a part of the Sino-centric world, but we had a completely independent culture. This is a kind of a new relationship, which I hope to rise in East Asia. But frankly speaking, China's policy taken recently it seems to be China is jumping back to the end of 19th century. And I don't see any flare of rising new thinking which would attract Japan and which would attract the world. But my optimistic, constructive thinking tells me that if China was a little more creative, whereas China was a little more tolerant to outside, then China should be able to come up with a new vision about which Japan will be very interested to listen, but from which Japan will try to create a new vision of our own. These should comprise several critical factors. Respect for human rights, basic democratic principles, openness, and accountability to the world. So what China is doing and what Japan is doing at this point, particularly if Japan will respond with this kind of Tsunokuni approach of gaining military power and fight back to China, what are we doing? both countries are not meeting the expectation of the airline.
No, very good. But let's give Professor Wang a chance to respond to that. I would also sort of add to that, not to pile on. I think you gave some very good advice regarding the need for both countries to better inform public opinion and to sort of rein in nationalism. But many people have been concerned that the Chinese government has been doing just the opposite, that they've seen playing the anti-Japan card as a way to sort of drum up a positive nationalism or increase credibility of the government. So I would be curious as to your views on how much China sees the current tensions as politically expedient as opposed to something that is worrisome.
Okay. Do I still have to answer your first question? Or
yes, no. Well, you're welcome to pick and choose at this point.
All right. Firstly, I think I completely agree with your observation. I think this is a very perceptive assessment. I think the Diaoyu Island Senkaku disputes really is a symptom of the larger problem, and it becomes very complicated if you look at the issue. It's about territorial disputes, sovereignty, very emotional issues, but also it has a lot to do with domestic politics, as you just alluded to, and also rising nationalism in both countries. And as the three panelists had also talked about, that there is also the issue of historical memory and how history is remembered, and that also has to do with identities of each country. So this issue really gets really complicated if we look at that. That's why at the beginning of my presentation, I said I want to inject a little bit, a grain of optimism into pessimism. So I wanted to go beyond the specific disputes a little bit. And go back to your second question. My personal observation, I actually, honestly, I have heard a lot of that concern from many American colleagues and friends, when we engage in very frank discussions. But honestly, I think my own impression is that the situation on the ground might be a little bit more complicated than that. I don't think that the Chinese government has a straightforward, clear-cut sort of policy that, okay, here is a opportunity that we should manipulate, we should explore this, we should play this anti-Japanese card, and let's go ahead and do it. I'm just afraid that that is not the case. And actually, I think more nuanced or version of the story might be more plausible in my own view. For instance, because the Chinese government simply I think if we look at just do a little bit of case study of how those the most recent protest, how they were organized, how they basically erupted. I think there are a lot of new factors we have to also take into account. For instance, the rise of new social media, the Xinlang Weibo, how those the new technological tools were used by Chinese netizens to organize and basically engage in this kind of collective action. And the Chinese government honestly, I think they are unable to, because when facing the rise outpour of this nationalism, this anger toward the Japanese actions. I think the Chinese government hands basically were tied. They couldn't, give order or prevent and also if we look at some of those cases, prominent cases, I think the Chinese government also were trying very hard to deploy police forces, trying to monitor the situation, but it's just they are not experienced, I think, handling a situation like that. And in Xi'an, I remember some tragic happened that a car owner of a Japanese car was attacked by some mobs and seriously injured. And later on, his family members start suing, I think, trying to bring the case to the court and try to sue the Xi'an police station of their inaction in protecting the security of a citizen, innocent citizen. So and our Chinese government also, afterwards of those protests, they also there are also many cases, they are trying to, track down and get hold of those suspects and criminal who are responsible for committing those crimes. So I think it's more complicated situation, and that I just don't think the Chinese government has a sort of a very single-handed, policy. We're going to play this card against Japanese, and I'm sure. Of course, this is my own guess, but I'm sure that Chinese top leaders, they are very much aware of the sort of negative, consequences of playing those kind of nationalism card. So I think they will be very careful about that.
Good. Thank you. And I should, I guess, remind the audience that everyone here is speaking for their own personal views. None of us represent our governments. Thank you. Alexander, let's go to you and ask you to respond. I will have to tell you that I may have slept through my classes on political theory, or it could be it was so long ago that I've forgotten it. But my sense
I'm sleeping through my classes as well.
Good.
And I'm teaching them.
My sense is most political leaders are political pragmatists with a small p, who are looking more at their own national interest and their own political survival than trying to put themselves in different categories. But I would welcome your comments on what you've heard so far.
Thank you very much. I mean, I must apologize for giving a wrong impression to Togo Sensei. I'm a constructivist as well, but I'm a pessimist by nature.
So that differs.
So the point of difference is not as big, or maybe actually it's bigger. But I would like to go back to your question. I think it's an excellent question. I think that Senkaku Diaoyu dispute is actually a symptom of a bigger problem, and being a constructivist, I look at ideas. And I think it's quite interesting to see what China has been for Japan. Some people will start from the post-war, but I think we actually can look at certain continuity starting from the 19th century. And what we see there, and in the post-war, in the 70s, and probably quite well until now, there's been a lot of sympathy among the Japanese leaders, among even the LDP, towards China. There have been some people with feelings of guilt towards China, to what Japan has done to China in the 30s and 40s. But the underlying notion is that of China is being backward, as China is being, an origin of, in many ways, of Japanese, the Japanese language and Japanese culture, but at the same time, of China as being backward, as being in need of guidance, and as being economically inferior to Japan. And I think that what we see today is very much, again, I'm looking at the Japanese side from a constructivist perspective, and I'm pretty sure that what Togo Sensei has said about the Chinese side is very valid. But from the Japanese side, I think there are problems dealing with the so-called the rise of China, China re-emerging or emerging as a world power, and it causes severe problems to Japanese identity. But at the same time, identity, or this national identities, they are constructed from episodes or from symptoms, or they're reinforced by different symptoms. And I think it's for us as scholars, it's quite interesting to see how these particular identities are constructed, created. And I think in this case, Senkaku Diaoyu dispute is quite interesting. And what what Togo Sensei has said, Ambassador Togo has said about, I guess, the role of contingency here, how political ambitions of Governor Ishihara, in many ways, have caused the escalation of this problem. But at the same time, I think it's very important to remember or to acknowledge that there's a broader ideational basis there on which this kind of symptoms fall, and they are created by this kind of ideational background, but at the same time they reinforce it and they make it more valid, more strong. So this is more or less what I had to say.
Professor So, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And what lessons are you drawing for Korea?
We have now 3 constructivists, including myself. But maybe I'll be a neutral one. Well, it's very interesting discussion, but I'd like to add some points regarding this nationalism or the CCP's responsibility of all those some troubles or voices inside of Chinese society. Is CCP omnipotent? Can they do everything? I tend to agree with Professor Wang that if they are so capable of controlling people's mind in that way, so bringing those hatred against Japan or hatred against the United States so easily when they need, then why they couldn't prevent, for instance, the Tiananmen Square, incident, or many other resistance of Xinjiang, Tibet, or others. Why they couldn't prevent it if they are omnipotent? CCP is not omnipotent. There, especially in the field of ideology, there is a certain limits they can control, and that is the situation we have to see. That this the rise of nationalism, rise of nationalism among Chinese leadership or People's Congress is one thing, but rise of nationalism in Chinese society is an entirely different one. And then but it's very interesting that outside of China, it's so easy to blame CCP. Whatever happens, then it's a CCP's manipulations. That is tantamount to the rise of far right-wing nationalism in Japan. Oh, that is LDP's scheme, or that's LDP's plans, or that's Japanese right-wing politicians' manipulation of Japanese people. Well, I don't think so. In both societies, there is a social sources of nationalism. Either that might be an economic reason, that is instability, or someone blames neoliberalism and the new economic system, or the threatened status of nation state in this globalizing economy. We have all different kinds of sources of nationalism, and then maybe CCP, some elements of CCP wants to mobilize it, but I think CCP knows very well that nationalism is an extremely dangerous weapon to use. That will eventually just will be a double-edged sword for them. That's for one point I want to say. And second, and then let's go a little bit deeper on the issue of constructivism and identity politics. Is Japan a defeated nation? Well, we don't often use that Germany as a defeated nation. Nazi Germany was defeated and German people were liberated. And that's very interesting that we just, so easily or so naturally say that Japan is a defeated nation. Well, a defeated nation, then definitely there is a strong sense of we have to come back to normal, not defeated or glorious or, whatever. So it seems, the history is very interestingly constructed in East Asia, unlike in case of Europe. That is something we have to, think again, that, the rise of Chinese nationalism or even Korean nationalism, there is a certain share of Japanese responsibility that they're going to, how to deal with these war criminals in the past, how to write about these comfort women or these historical issues. They're just, in many ways interacting each other. So the state is not fully controlling these societal discourses. And then now the state's role should be how to manage these radical discourses coming from society, how state should manage all of them. That is, they should share responsibility. Chinese government or Japanese government, they all have a certain kinds of responsibility of just letting all those extremist voices out to international scenes. And then how to manage it. In democratic society, that's very difficult. But China, is not fully democratic. Still, it's very difficult because they are one of the best wired countries, and then those millions of young voices just traveling across the world and then posting on internet, etc. Finally,
very briefly.
It seems we have to appreciate something about China, about maintaining stability. We can blame China as not democratic, human rights issues, Tibet, etc., etc. But in this part, I'm returning to become a realist. That assume unstable China. That will be a real tragedy in East Asia. So at least, all these kinds of political revisions or negotiation, all those things, we have to assume that we all want and we all need a stable China and also stable Japan too. That is our primary. That should be our primary concern.
Good. Thank you. Let's open the floor up and take a few questions. Since we're running short on time, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions and then we'll come back. Professor Shi, yeah. If you would identify yourself and also.
Right. China, and I would like to make short comments about the last excellent question and my young colleagues in Beijing University's the discussion about the Chinese government and the Chinese nationalism. I think that of course, and a lot of Sino-Japanese confrontation and hostility have numerous fundamental structural causes, and so in this sense that the Diaoyu crisis and confrontation extraordinary and is a symptom. But this is a very special symptom. The very special symptom itself become a part of cause. And if you look at the Sino-Japan relations in bad times, they are normal bad times, tense, hostility and bad relations. But and both China and Japan only have 3 crises since 1945 almost. And one is Kozumi's, go to Yasukuni Shrine, 2005. And the second is 2010, and September, Diaoyu crisis. And now Diaoyu crisis. The crisis itself, and extremely important, symptom, but it transforms itself into part of, cause to make the Sino-Japanese hostility and confrontation and go, and especially now, and just I fully agree with the Japanese professor's point of view that really, and this full of possibility of military conflict. So for future Sino-Japan relations, it's still bad, but not so bad, and have some hope of, constructive, progress. The precondition is to deal with this planned crisis. Otherwise, there's no hope. And for Chinese government to rule, and with Chinese popular nationalism, I think that we should make a differentiation. Normal times and crisis, and especially heat of the crisis. 1 week, 2 weeks, such like. And in normal times, and Chinese government is fully aware and worried about the, so-called the danger to Chinese domestic stability from popular nationalism. And the Chinese government know that the too much excessive, national feeling toward Japan is not a good thing. But the problem is that Chinese government, especially in the case of Japan, and generally they are not, and have no patience to guide the public opinion. But in the heat of crisis, and for example this time, and since September 10th to maybe at least September 18th, I think that I have to recognize Chinese government during these days a precursor of nationalism.
Thank you. Comments, question? Ken, please. Yeah, right here in front, please. And then this gentleman right here next.
Kenneth Liebethal of the Brookings Institution. Let me ask, these are very interesting and deep comments that we've heard here. Let me ask a very simple question. What is the realistic, pessimistic view of what can happen in Japanese politics if there is some incident where some people are killed around Diaoyu or Senkaku? In other words, suppose some of these boats have an unintended incident, it begins to escalate. How far might this go in Japanese politics? Create the feasible reconsideration of key elements in the Constitution? Produce more assertive military presence in the region? I mean, what might happen here in the coming 4 months if something bad happens on the water? And what I'm asking for is the pessimistic view.
Right. It's hard to find an optimistic view of that.
Pessimistic but realistic. I mean, what are the boundaries of pessimism?
Yeah, this gentleman here, and then we'll go to General Pan next, please.
Young Bukh at Asan Institute. I guess Professor Libothel stole my thunder. What about the Article 5 of U.S.-Japan Security Treaty? Assuming there is a casualties of Japanese soldiers or citizens, would it be mobilized by the United States? Or?
Good. General Pang?
Actually, I have this almost the same question as South Korea. Actually, I was very curious about the role of the United States or in the Sino-Japan relations. This kind of ambiguity actually now written into the United States law, possibly saying that the United States will not take sides, but at the same time would cover Diao as the security alliance indicates. So I just wondering how our Japanese colleague view this kind of ambiguity. And particularly for the long run, if Japan really goes to the right, do you think the United States will feel comfortable with the future policy orientation of a very conservative, very righteous kind of government? As far as I know, those conservative elements hate China, but perhaps also hate the United States.
General Yamaguchi. Yeah.
Thank you, General Pan. My name is Yamaguchi from National Defense Academy of Japan. I just wanted to intervene about mutual security treaty because I have been working on this so long. Actually, there are a number of misunderstandings or people who have mistook what the MST says. But basically, Article 5 of MST has three conditions. The first one is under Japanese administration. That is one. The second one is this is against armed attack. It's not against criminal or just the fishing boats ramming into another boat. And thirdly, joint action. So so far, U.S. attitude has been consistent. That U.S. never takes a position. Any position on sovereignty issue or territorial disputes. But MST, as far as the administrative control, U.S. Diaoyu Tai or Senkaku had been under the U.S. military administration before the version of Okinawa. So administration is under Japanese. So that is clear. And third position is a joint action. Joint action means U.S. and Japan should work together. So any place, don't forget about Senkaku. Even Tokyo, if Japan does not want to defend ourselves, there is no reason why U.S. is involved. So those are the conditions, and we don't want to make that issue escalated, and perhaps Chinese and Japanese have the 1,000-year-long historical wisdom. So in the future, for the better future, we can work it out. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for that clarification. Any last question before I go to my panelists? Well, good. Let's start. Let's go. Oh, I'm sorry, Doug. Yeah, please.
This is a very basic question.
Doug Paul from
Carnegie Endowment, right. Sorry. Very basic question, maybe to Togo-san or anybody. And the question is, why can Japan not acknowledge that while it claims full sovereignty over the islands, there is a dispute nonetheless that others have raised? Why is this itself something that can't be acknowledged?
Okay, well, let me go to our four panelists. Togo-sensei, let's start with you, since I think many of the questions were directed towards you, so I'll give you a little extra time. And then also any closing comment? Any closing comment that you want to make?
I think some of the questions were already answered by General Yamaguchi.
Yeah.
So first, to Doug's question, I already mentioned in my intervention that I am very critical against Japan's today's Gaimusho's position, denying the existence of dispute. I think this is contrary to the fact, and this is dangerous, and this is contradictory. Why government is taking this position? Well, I don't know. They sort of only hope that now government is raising price of this position, and in a showdown, which I do hope which would occur in the new government, they will change this position. This is, I don't know, but now in answering to your question, if I understood correctly, you asked what will be Japan's view to U.S. reaction to this rising right-wing bent Japanese government. Was it correct, that question? Well, let us not forget that 67 years ago, Japan and the United States were at war. And the United States was fighting against one of the, sort of in this present-day terminology, one of the worst right-wing bent Japanese government. If the United States sees in Japan a kind of coming back of this kind of administration, this will be very dangerous to our alliance. But I hope that the bent to the right in Japan does not go to that extent. And also, I think there's a real need for Japan to become a more, what we call in Japanese, jiritsuta koka, self-standing nation. And this applies to the alliance as well. Japan should bear greater responsibility and greater action in terms of implementing our alliance. And this means a certain distancing from the US. This means Japan, who has a security capability and foreign policy capability to deal with China on its own responsibility. Now, I'm sure that this kind of more jiritsuta Japan, more self-standing Japan, which would have a more kind of independent position within the alliance management and in our policy toward China, would basically be welcomed by the United States. I don't know whether I answered to your question, but...
Good, thank you. Professor Wang, any closing comments that you want to make, and any responses?
Okay, I think I just want to make like two quick comments. One is also, I just want to add to one of the previous questions, Ms. Cossa, you raised, and also I think it was touched upon by professors in his short comment. This is how Chinese government is responding to the outburst of nationalism, this protest. I think there's also one phenomena, one thing that we should also note, that is the Chinese government actually, I think, not immediately, I think, after those protests took place, the government also trying very hard to, quote unquote, guide the public opinion. And if we look at all major medias, newspapers, they start talking about, trying to advocate in promoting this discourse that we ought to, have this kind of, we call it rational patriotism, 理性的爱国主义, instead of, this blind nationalism. So I think the Chinese government actually also very careful in dealing with that. And another thing that I want to briefly touch upon is the U.S. role in the Diaoyu Island Senkaku disputes. And in my own understanding that the United States is essentially what it's doing here is taking the position is a dual deterrence strategy. On the one hand, trying to deter China from taking unilateral actions in changing status quo on the other hand, but also the United States trying to restrain Japan from further taking provocations. And there are some people, maybe more than some, in China, they believe that the United States actually play a sort of key role in creating, sort of cook up the situation in Diaoyu Island in the first place. And there are a lot of conspiracy theories circling around in China. Some involving the so-called the impending plans between China and Japan to go ahead with a currency swamp as a potential threat to the so-called dollar dominance. Therefore, the United States want to go ahead and preempt, that, and by encouraging Ishihara Shintaran to go ahead and explore the issue. So I personally completely disagree with that kind of analysis. I think it's overly simplistic and quite misleading. I think the United States psychologically, I also believe the United States tended to tilt toward Japan a little more because of the alliance relationship, and also because the United States believe that Japan is a so-called liberal democracy. Therefore you have a lot of trust and faith in Japan's restraint. But also when it comes to this specific dispute, I think the United States has deliberately maintained a kind of ambiguity over this issue. If you look at the two positions the United States is taking, on the one hand, it say, the United States does not take a position over the sovereignty claim. Basically, essentially acknowledging there is a dispute. But also says Article 5 of the Mutual Treaty applies to Diaoyu Island. And I think apparently there's inherent contradiction between these two positions. But by putting them together, it creates this kind of ambiguity that allow United States try to manage the situation in the way of the dual deterrence strategy I just talked about, and try to protect, I think, U.S. interests and also de-escalate the crisis from first escalating into real conflict.
Good.
Very quickly.
1 minute. Please.
1 minute.
Right.
So first, Japan tacitly, in a very ambiguous way, admitted that there is a dispute by saying that if China takes it to ICJ, I think it was either Gemba or Noda. So actually, Japan has admitted, not only in a symbolic way, as Professor Togo said, by preventing its citizens from entering the islands. It was only a week or last week. So this is one point. Another point, I'm very skeptical about U.S. going to a war with China over Japanese problems. And I think the best lesson is Georgia's war with Russia 4 years ago. Georgia is obviously not Japan, and the nature of U.S. relations with Georgia very different from those with Japan, but I think it's a good lesson there. If there are some Japanese, it will very much depend who and how dies, and this is something I think it's not really ethically to speculate about. I mean, your question, what happens if the Japanese citizens that die. But I think overall, kind of realistic, pessimistic scenario would be a couple of short-term symbolic measures, such as recalling of ambassadors, protests, this kind of stuff. But I think definitely in long term it will give a push towards constitutional revision and possibly nuclear development of nuclear weapons. I think this is definitely a possibility. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, any last comment?
Okay. I don't think if there are a few citizens, either Japanese or Chinese citizens, killed on Senkaku or Diaoyu, it does not bring a war. But because this whole dispute over the islands is basically a symptom of something, phenomenon of some more fundamental issues, the rise of China or the the sense of insecurity in Japan. All those things just combined, and then this island also strong sense of history too in East Asia. All those things just combined, and then the disputes emerges. So a small accident on the island does not bring the war. But if there is a fundamental causes are just accumulated, then maybe Senkaku might be an excuse of bringing more serious military conflicts. So it's not the island itself, but it's more broad structural issue in East Asia, and that identity involved, history involved, and then the sense of security, sense of sovereignty, all those just combined. So, okay, the issue is fundamentally complex. We have to acknowledge it. It's complex. It's not that easy issue. Then we need more time and we need more communication channels to solve it eventually. That's my comments.
Thank you. Well, let me end by making three very quick observations, and I go to some of the questions that were clearly aimed at Americans in the room. First of all, I don't think any American who knows Japan loses a lot of sleep over Japan of the 1930s returning. That is just not in the cards. We don't see that. We don't worry about that. We have a great deal more confidence in our ally than to worry about that kind of a scenario. I think what Americans do worry about is Japan creating difficulties for itself in working with its neighbors, and Japan destroying its own soft power, the soft power in the international reputation, the solid international reputation that Japan has built over the last 60 years. Sometimes I think our Korean and Chinese friends think that history ended 60 years ago. But if you look at the record of the past 60 years of Japan, there is no nation on earth that has more to be proud of than the way Japan has played as a responsible international citizen. And they could put that reputation at risk just psychologically in the way things, and I think Americans worry much more about that. I will also say that no American who knows Asia loses a lot of sleep over some type of a Japanese-Chinese condominium that is going to work to America's disadvantage. Again, most of us understand history. We think it's regrettable how China and Japan don't get along. I don't think any American loses sleep over the reverse. What we do lose sleep over is the fact of one side or the other, with neither one wanting to create a problem and not wanting to create a conflict. Even if you have Coast Guard versus Coast Guard, people can still get killed. There can still be accidents. It can still spiral out of control, and that's what we lose sleep over. That's one of the reasons why we just had a bipartisan team, incidentally headed by the co-chairman of the Pacific Forum's Board of Governors, Joe Nye and Rich Armitage, who went to Japan and who went to China to try to sort of reassure both sides of where we stand in that. But my final point, without trying to be controversial or confrontational, the U.S. is not either ambiguous or neutral when it comes to the Senkaku's dispute. The U.S. has made it very clear that it wants to see Japan and China settle the territorial dispute peacefully, but it has also made it very clear that we recognize Japanese administrative control over the Senkakus. The reason we recognize that is that we gave the Senkakus to Japan to administer. This was in American hands after World War II. It was provided to Japan at the time of Okinawa's reversion. An armed attack on the Senkakus invokes the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and the U.S. has made it very clear we will help Japan defend itself in that situation. Now, if the Japanese response, as General Yamaguchi says, if Japan's response is, take the islands, we don't care, then there's no dispute. My guess is that would not be the Japanese response, and that we would go down a path that nobody wants to go down. But we shouldn't mistake U.S. neutrality over territorial claims with either U.S. neutrality in case of a dispute or ambiguity as far as which side, quote unquote, that we would be on if a dispute occurred. I think that's very clear, and if you read what U.S. officials have been saying, not just in the last 3 years, but in the last 30 years, that point comes across very closely. All the more reason we would like to see the dispute handled peacefully. All the more reason we believe that Japan and China need to get beyond just looking at the dispute and coming to terms with the historical problems, with the symbolism. And part of that, again, my own view is part of that requires China's public opinion to be a little bit more informed on the role that Japan has taken in the last 60 years in helping China rise and in creating the interdependent world that is a reality today. So with those last couple of words, let me ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for a very stimulating discussion. I think we now have